Okay, so this is our great pleasure and honor to have today the first dialogue, PhilInBioMed Dialogue. So, as you know, the seminar is in philosophy, in biology, and medicine. And we have had many wonderful philosophers of biology and theoretical biologists over the years. But today is a little bit special because we have organized this debate, dialogue, discussion, we'll see, between Sam Scheiner and Alkistis Elliott-Greaves. We're very excited about it. Um, just to say a few words about the organization, it's going to be 15 minutes for Sam, 15 minutes for Alkistis, then 15 minutes of discussion between them, and then the floor will be open for any questions or comments by people in this virtual room. In total, it should be a little bit more than 1 hour, maybe 70 to 80 minutes. Um, Sam is a former program director at NSF and now an independent scholar. He's been long interested in ecology and theoretical ecology in particular, and more generally, theoretical biology, evolutionary biology as well. Among his main publications, I have emphasized on the website Genetics and Evolution of Phenotypic Plasticity, a very well cited paper, and also books, Phenotypic Plasticity, Functional and Conceptual Approaches at Oxford, and The Ecology of Plants at Sinauer Associates in 2002. Alkistis, our second speaker, is a professor in philosophy at Bielefeld University in Germany. She works in philosophy of science, general philosophy of science, and especially philosophy of applied science, including and mainly ecology and climate science. Um, she has had a very rich life. She went to different places, and as I said, she's now based in Germany, in Bielefeld, what is, as you know, a wonderful group of people. And among the main publications by Alkistis, I have emphasized the problem of prediction in invasion biology in 2016 and generality and causal interdependence in ecology, another paper published in 2018. And recently, 1 or 2 years ago, she published a book at Cambridge called Ecological Complexity. So as you can see, these were really the two perfect speakers for this dialogue. So again, I'm very excited about it. I'm still admitting 3 more people, which brings us to almost 60. And the floor is yours, Sam, for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay. So you can see my title slide, I hope.
Yes.
Um, okay. So, uh, bonjour et merci. And that's most of my spoken French. Uh, I'm very happy to join today. I'm also a little intimidated with all these philosophers in the audience. I am not a philosopher. I'm a practitioner that has sort of dabbled a little bit in on the philosophy side, and so uh, we'll see how you take what I'm going to say. Um, in terms, oh, let's see. There we go. Uh, for a little bit of background, and I'll put this up again right at the end. Uh, for the historical stuff I'm going to talk to, there is the paper in Ecological Letters. There's also this book on theory and ecology, and there's other stuff. If you just put my name into Google Scholar, you'll be able to get to a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So, what I really want to talk about is, theory, as ecologists have practiced theory, and a lot of it has to do with problems, not in what they're doing, but what they think about theory. So, you may be familiar with the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke, who came up with this famous law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The ecological version, the ecologist version, is any sufficiently complex theory is indistinguishable from magic. Most ecologists are sort of intimidated by theory, and I think that's because they have a very uh, poor attitude towards it. Here's just one example of problem of the attitude towards theory. When Mike Willig and I came up with the first version of our theory of ecology paper, we submitted it to the journal Ecology, the leading journal in the US, certainly of the ecological science. And this is what we got back: the manuscript is too philosophical. Yeah, it's about theory. And really, what the person meant by philosophical was really conceptual. And that's, I think, a lot of where the problem lies. Ecologists tend to be very, very empirically focused. So, what I'm going to talk about today is what ecologists think they are doing when it comes to theory versus actually what they're doing. And they're doing a lot more theory than they think they are. But first, we need to establish what theory is and isn't. This is probably, if you polled ecologists and asked them, what is theory, almost certainly what they're going to tell you is, oh, well, theory is math, and that math stuff is hard. But in fact, that's not true. Let's just take probably the two most influential documents in the last 200 years, in the 19th and the 20th century: Darwin and then Watson and Crick's paper. Neither of them have any math in there at all, right? So the some of the most important theory in our disciplines are not mathematical. So what do I mean by theory? And this is where you folks as the philosophers know this better than I do, but I'm taking it as a definition: a coherent group of general propositions used as principles for explanation of a class of phenomena. This all comes from the pragmatic view of theories, and I'm not going to go into details about what that is. But what I would like to talk about is something which I put forward as a as a way to think about theory structure in what we do, and dividing theory into various different kinds of theories that exist in sort of a hierarchy, where we've got general theories, constitutive theories, and models. Models are what most people think about theory. This is where hypotheses are generated, predictions are made and tested. This is where the math is. Then a constitutive theory is really a modeling blueprint. So Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is a modeling blueprint. And then we have general theories, which is model assumptions, a way of sort of making explicit model assumptions. And what I'm going to talk about are these constitutive theories. That's what I think should be the focus when we ask the question: how much theory or ecology have they done, and what are they doing? Um, so, first of all, theory and journal articles. So, about a dozen or so years ago, it was the 100th anniversary of the journal Ecology. I was asked to participate in a seminar, and I did a little analysis. I went through, took one issue for once per decade, and just classified each of the articles into one of four cases. Either there was no theory at all mentioned in the paper, there was a theory is mentioned in the introduction, motivating the work, but otherwise not really discussed. Then there were papers that were actually explicitly testing one or more theories. And then there were papers that would have been theory development, model building, conceptual frameworks, and so forth. And in what I'm going to show you next, when I talk about papers which have theory in them or not, are these last two categories were the ones uh, that I called theory papers, or had theory in them. And so in that journal Ecology, over 100 years, and this is a little outdated now, it's about a decade old, but here you can see there was almost no theory at all in the journal for about the first 50 years. And then starting in the early 60s, a steady increase in the amount of theory, so that now about half the papers have some kind of theory in them. Uh, but half, that's not really all that great. If we compare that ecology to its sister discipline, evolutionary biology, and we look at two of the leading journals for evolution, which is the leading journal on the evolution side, and then American Naturalist, which is an even older journal, but straddles between ecology and evolution. There, the papers, are more like 80, 90%, focused on theory. So ecology, you know, I mean, it's there, but you would think that there would be more. I will note, I also did a comparison of contemporary journals, and Oikos, which is um, a European journal, comes out much better when it comes to theory. Um, but in fact, there is quite a lot of theory in ecology. This is a chapter from our Theory of Ecology book by Jared Kalasa, just showing, and this is not even complete, but showing you when a lot of these things that we think of as theories in ecology were first presented. And you notice a lot of them 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even before that increase in the journals. And there's even more today. Um, so there's a compilation of classic papers of ecology, which was done in the early 90s, called Foundations of Ecology. If you go in there and you classify all these papers, interestingly enough, what the majority of the papers that were chosen as classic papers are actually theory papers. So practitioners in ecology recognize theory as really the basis of the discipline, even if uh, those classic papers aren't necessarily being cited as justification uh, for for work that's being done. So where is ecology now and where is it going? There actually is, in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, on increased interest in theory as models, new journals. So theoretical ecology, which is actually where we ended up publishing our theory of ecology paper, and there's a brand new society in the US on modeling and theory and population biology. The pandemic, in particular, has driven a lot of interest in finally in the value of ecological modeling uh, beyond the small group of theoretical ecologists. The empiricists are now working a lot more with ecologists, with theoreticians than they ever were. There's been a lot more various pushes, for example, at the funding agency I used to be at, the US National Science Foundation, to really push collaborative efforts between theoreticians and modelers. So, uh, what I would say is that uh, ecologists, although they've always been um, a little hesitant when it comes to theory, interestingly enough, after that guest editorial was published in Ecology Letters, one of the comments that somebody posted somewhere in social media is that, oh, I was trying to push more math on people. And in fact, I explicitly say in that paper, no, theory is not the equivalent of math. What I've been trying to push is actually much more conceptual approaches, and I think that's really um, where scientists in general tend to be much more empirically focused rather than conceptually focused. And so this is actually part of a larger effort of mine to try to push more conceptual thoughts uh, in biology as a whole. And so actually, I'm going to take less than my 15 minutes. I guess we'll save the questions for later. So let me just stop the share and we'll go on to Alkistis.
Thank you, Sam. And indeed, if Alkistis, you're ready, we can move directly to your talk. We see the slides
Yes.
perfectly well. Oh, it's still a little bit decentered as previously.
There.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, let me go back. Okay. So, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here, and this is a great opportunity, so I'm looking forward to it. So, I'll start with this painting, which is titled The Struggle for Existence. It was painted in 1879 by George Goddard. This is 20 years after the origin of species, and it depicts a fight to the death between wolves. And it's obviously not scientifically accurate, but I think it helps illustrate how a lot of people deal with kind of ideas in biology. There's ideas in biology, and then people kind of deal with them in their own way. So what I'm going to talk about today is a set of theoretical issues in ecology that have affected, I think, the perception of ecology as a scientific discipline. And you could argue that it reflects a sort of struggle for the existence of the discipline itself. I am exaggerating for effect, but you'll see what I mean. Still, I'll end on a more optimistic note because I think we've come a long way since then. Okay, so let's start properly with a quick story. In the mid-1980s, a group of scientists were investigating the effects of bird guano on intertidal communities, and they made an interesting discovery. There's two islands less than 4 kilometers apart, but they have very different benthic communities. In the first, there's both whelks and lobsters, and in the second, there's way more whelks and no lobsters. Not almost no lobsters, no lobsters. After talking to some local fishermen who told them that there used to be lobsters on both islands, but not anymore. So they thought that this would be a great kind of opportunity to conduct an experiment. What that meant was they got a postdoc to do it. So lobsters eat whelks. So what they thought they could do is test whether an introduction of lobsters would reduce the number of whelks. There's good theory for this expectation. It's based on a very well-established theory, the so-called Lotka-Volterra predation model. As you see here, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail. I'm happy to talk about it more later. But predators and prey can change based on the existence and the size of the population of the other. The growth of predators is limited by the availability of prey, and their own mortality. The growth of prey is limited by the rate of predation. So if you add the whelks and the lobsters to the mix, you get, you put the numbers in, you get something. So what the scientists expected was the following. If you introduce 1,000 lobsters into the island with no lobsters, what would you expect? Well, you would expect the rate of predation to increase and the population of prey to decrease, right? That's what the theory predicts. Except that's not what happened. What happened is this. If you can see. Yes. So these are pictures of what actually happened. Within 40 minutes, the whelks had eaten the lobsters. 1,000 lobsters were completely annihilated in 40 minutes. Now, obviously the postdoc was a bit worried because negative results tend to not get published so easily. But the important thing is that this was surprising to the scientists. The scientists could have expected that maybe you'd introduce the lobsters, maybe they'd kind of sort of eat the whales, but not too much. They were not expecting the prey to become predators. Now, it turns out that this is one of the first documented cases of so-called predator-prey reversal, which now we know happens. But at the time, the scientists were very surprised. Now, according to ecologists themselves, surprise is frequent in their discipline. So this paper from 2008, the Doak and colleagues identified 6 paradigmatic cases of surprise, and then they conducted a survey of ecologists. So these are established field ecologists, and they asked them, how often have you encountered surprises like the ones we talk about? And this predator-prey reversal example is one of the kind of paradigmatic cases of surprise. And 98% of the ecologists said that they frequently, routinely encounter surprises of this sort. So what does that mean? Well, both ecologists and philosophers will agree. I mean, any scientist, I think, will agree that some amount of surprise is important because it helps with scientific progress. But how much surprise is good, and when does surprise end up being too much surprise? So there is a set of views in philosophy of science which say that too much surprise is bad because of its relation to prediction. So there are traditional views in philosophy of science that state that frequent surprises demonstrate a lack of predictability. And failure to make precise and accurate predictions is a hallmark of a science that is not good in some way. It's not sufficiently mature, it's not sufficiently hard as a science. And on this view, ecology as a discipline suffers from surprises, therefore suffers from a lack of predictive power. So what should you do? Well, ecologists should get their act together and spend more time trying to get better at predictions. Who says this? A lot of people who are quite vocal about it. So I have a couple of slides of sort of established ecologists who espouse aspects of this view. One of the most important critiques of this type was in 1991 by Peters, who wrote a whole book called The Critique of Ecology, where he writes that he's worried about the status of ecology and the status of ecological research because it's not organized like a proper science. If you go over there and look at how physics and chemistry work, they go out there, they build theories, and they test them. And ecologists are not doing this in the right way, he says, in the sense that they're not generating enough theories and they're not testing them in the right way. Now, in 2019, John Grace accepts this view of science and says, yes, but well, actually, ecologists managed to do that. So ecology has grown up. Now it's a mature science, precisely because ecologists spent a lot of time talking about theories, finding the theories, and testing them. But other ecologists worry that despite these advances, ecology is still lacking in terms of both theory building and theory testing through prediction. So Jeff Houlihan and colleagues have a paper, and this is the sort of synthesis of the paper, which says ecology has abandoned prediction and therefore the ability to demonstrate understanding. So they go through in the paper of how, which theories they believe are lacking, the ways in which they're lacking, and what ecologists should be doing in order to make ecology better. So if anyone wants the full list of ecologists who have some version of this view, which my former colleague Janni Rairinen interprets as a Popperian outlook towards ecology, you can find it in this paper. He goes through the list of ecologists who kind of write about this way of viewing science. And then he kind of has a bit of a go at them by saying that, well, you don't want a Popperian outlook in science, in a science like ecology. So I'm not going to go through the quotes. I've just put them up so you have an idea of what these people are saying. If you want, at the end, there's references so you can go and look them up. Now, if we're thinking of whether or not ecology kind of succeeds or fails, is this a correct view of science? I have many views about this. And they are that this is the wrong view of science. I don't think it even works for the physics and chemistry that Popper and his friends had in mind. It definitely doesn't work for ecology. But this, I think, is not the fault of ecologists. It's the fault of the old philosophy of science. I think part of the problem the problem of prediction in the way that these people are talking about it is not a problem in ecology, but a problem of kind of either misunderstanding traditional philosophy of science or not misunderstanding it, and the actual traditional philosophy of science not being applicable to a science like ecology. And what do I mean by a science like ecology? That would be an entire talk in itself. I'm already talking 10 minutes, so I'm not going to go into that in excruciating detail. The punchline is ecological systems are complex in a special way. They're not just made up of many interacting parts, but they're also very heterogeneous, both within the systems and across the systems. So what that means is that the knowledge that you get from investigating one system doesn't necessarily generalize to another system because the systems are so different. In terms of prediction, what happens is that what you learn about the system right now doesn't necessarily generalize to the same system in the future because the system is changing its behavior. So you can think of climate change as an example of how you can drive change, where you think you know what was happening and then the system suddenly behaves differently, and it's not kind of your fault that you failed to predict it. Okay, so that is to say that what I think is that ecology is a particularly difficult science. It's not the only very difficult science, but it's a very difficult science to get right in terms of prediction. But that shows us, rather than showing us that kind of, it says less about ecology than it says about our view of what science ought to look like and what the role of prediction in science could be. So I've used the example of ecology to argue for updating all of philosophy of science and in terms of what we expect the role of prediction to be. And enough about that work. I will end in the last couple minutes on a much more optimistic note. I think the way forwards is to integrate philosophy and ecology a lot more. And I think it's already happening because ecologists and philosophers are collaborating. We recently published a paper with many philosophers and many ecologists together. And it was a very rewarding project. And this, I think, this along with some others show that there are good precedents for collaboration, but I think that we need much more of the same. So what is going on in this paper, I think, is rather cool. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. And if anyone is interested in more collaboration with philosophers and ecologists, this might be a good place to start looking at how to go about it. So the first thing we did is we have a list of topics that have a philosophical and an ecological dimension. For each, we outline the topic along with the main issues, what has been said by ecologists and philosophers about it, and all of the references. So we do that with a list of topics that we kind of got together and found. So if anyone is interested in any of those topics, then you have kind of the main views in ecology and philosophy for each. And some references for kind of where to start. The second thing that we did in this paper is at the appendix. There's a list of philosophers of ecology who are willing to be contacted by ecologists to either answer questions or who are open to kind of various forms of collaboration. Yes, and with that, I will end on this more optimistic, positive note of what I think the future of theory, philosophy, and ecology should be. And thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you to Professor Scheiner. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Alkistis. So we start now. So thank you so much for everything, including sticking to the clock. So that's very, very cool. We have about 15 minutes just for you, Sam and Alkistis. So where do you want to start?
So,
Maybe, yeah, Sam, go ahead.
yeah, no, I was going to say I've been making notes. I've got about 2 or 3 minutes of things to say in response to Alkistis, and then she can come back
Wonderful.
uh, to me. So, first of all, I agree completely with Alkistis that the problem is on the philosophy side, not the ecology side. That there biologists suffer from what's called physics envy, right? Right, philosophy of science was built by physicists or people looking at physics uh, as the paradigm of how science works, and biology is very different just because biological systems are way more complicated, both complicated and complex, which are not the same thing, than physical systems. And so it's not surprising that we have to take a different approach, that we need to separate out prediction from understanding. I come from this not only as an ecologist, but also as an evolutionary biologist. And in evolution, you know, we from the very beginning, right? We, at least in terms of the theoretical side, in the modern synthesis, the importance of things like drift, and stochasticity has always been seen as really important in evolutionary systems. And ecologists have, I think it's taken a while for ecologists to also embrace that stochasticity, which means that predictions what you make your predictions are a probability distribution rather than a point prediction. And so it's not surprising that then when you test a probability distribution with a point, with a single point, they don't match up. And so that's really where I think this disconnect between understanding and prediction comes from, that we can perfectly understand the system and have a model, but it's got the stochastic component, which means that when you test, you don't test against one system. You have to test against a variety of systems in which you're going to see that stochastic variation. Bob Lawton, I think it's 1998, I think is the right year for that paper, points out that that community, in fact, is the worst level at which you try to make predictions, because it's the one that's the most complex. At the level of populations, or sort of at higher levels at ecosystems where you're making predictions about, total energy flow and so forth, your predictions are much more easier to make because you have less complexity at those limits. And I would say that ecology as a discipline showed uh, its worth in terms of predictions during the pandemic, because that was a simple system, right? You had one host, the virus and humans, and it's much easier to, despite the social complexities and everything, it's much easier to make predictions at that level, and at least where the people were paying attention to the mathematicians, you actually could get useful information out of those predictions. Um, so I'll leave it there for now and turn it over to Alkistis.
Thank you. So I don't disagree with, I don't think anything that you said really. I think I sort of have some kind of nitpicky points that I want to make. So the first is not that nitpicky, but it's kind of in agreement to what you're saying. I agree that kind of evolutionary biology got around this problem. And I think two things happened at once. First of all, they realized that explanation is kind of a really big deal in evolutionary biology. So a lot of evolutionary biologists focus on explaining why populations are this way rather than another way. And then you could do that nicely with kind of fitting data to models. So it was sufficiently scientific and on many other metrics that you didn't have to worry about prediction. At the same time, philosophers of biology also made the point that, well, that's kind of, you don't need to be making predictions with evolutionary theory because the kind of level at which the models are operating and the kind of predictions that you would make don't really match up. So you can say something about, in the next generation, what's the prevalence of this gene, this allele compared to that allele going to be? Sure, that's fine. But when we say you can say, well, what kinds of birds are we going to have in a million years, right? That's not the kind of prediction. And I think the problem is that possibly because of the way that the kind of ecology evolved as a discipline, I think ecologists kind of felt that they had to make much more hardcore predictions than their theories could kind of deal with. So part of that is the sort of history. I think Sharon Kingsland has a few very nice books of the history of ecology and how kind of mathematical theories were seen as making the difference between kind of just natural history, which is stamp collecting, and a real science. So there's that dimension. And also I think a lot of ecology is very applied. So there's a huge aspect of ecology which, the ecologists have to go out and do conservation science. Like they have to prevent extinctions, they have to get rid of invasive species, they have to do all sorts of things. And those require much more a certain type of prediction that is much harder to get right. Because it's all, and the complexity, there's another level of it. You don't just have to have a theory that makes a prediction. You have data which is really bad often. As I tell my students, have you ever tried counting mice? They are fast and they hide, right? So you have patchy, incomplete data sets. You often have very little time. So you need to figure out what you need to do, and you actually need to go and implement it before the damn thing dies out. And you also have very high stakes in the sense that if you make a prediction in your lab and it turns out false, worst case scenario, your paper isn't going to get published. But if that is the last population of X in the wild and you get it wrong and it dies out, that's it. So you have all of this applied stuff, which kind of puts a lot more pressure on getting predictions right, but also you're at a disadvantage given what you have to work with. So I think that's kind of, you were right to point out that ecology is very complex in certain ways. And I think it's kind of even more complex when you're looking at the applied aspect of it.
So I think this brings up an interesting point about where ecology is as a discipline today, in that, and you're exactly right. It's the fact that not only is our ecologists faced with a lot of applied problems, but they're also ones that are very time sensitive. And, we have to do things now. But what's happened in the last, 25, 30 years is much more of a Bayesian approach to these problems. And I mean that both in the formal mathematical sense of using Bayesian statistical approaches, but also in the sense of a Bayesian sort of mindset says that you're always updating your parameter estimates as new data comes in, and that when you manage something, you don't like make a decision today and then that's it. You just, you set the thing and you let it go. Is that you have to continually monitor the situation and modify whatever your management plan is as conditions change, both because maybe the model wasn't correct. For example, who knew that whelks would eat the lobsters? But also because, there's external forcing factors that you have no control over, changes in climate or land use, right? So some builder comes in and builds something next to your wetland and changes the hydrology, and suddenly the system is changing. And so I think that if we want to talk about where is ecology going in the future, that kind of uh, that that kind of mindset has really changed the way ecologists look at these applied projects and how it interfaces with theory in a formal sense, right? So managers were always doing this, right? But it was always by seat of the pants. Now you've got much more formal ways of sort of bringing that formal theory into management practice in a way that responds to change.
Do I get to say
Yeah.
a bit more?
If you can, if you want, and if you, yeah, that's that. We still
Yeah,
have
we got about
officially
another
four
5 minutes.
minutes on the discussion.
Cool. So I agree with you, and I also want to point out, I want to not point out, but point to and highlight three different initiatives that are happening in ecology, which are doing different aspects of what you said. So I think that there's been a shift in attitude towards prediction in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. And instead of just saying, oh no, prediction is hard, groups of ecologists are kind of attacking the problem of prediction from different angles. And I want to talk about these very briefly. So there's one group in Switzerland, in Zurich, Owen Petchy and Frank Pennekam's lab. What they did is really cool. They created microcosms of freshwater systems in the lab. And they're making predictions on these closed systems to test the predictability. So how does prediction fare over something like I think it's 4 years, based on many, many variables, but within closed systems. So they're looking at kind of where the predictability kind of starts to fail and trying to figure out why. So that's kind of one dimension of kind of tackling or trying to open the black box of prediction. The second is Mike Dietzy's group in Boston, who are doing near-term iterative forecasting. So they're using big data that's also based on common ways of collecting data, and that's very important. So they've generated these huge data sets, and then now they're looking at iterative forecasting, where you train your model, you look at some data and you train it again, but you do it in a transparent way, so it's not kind of just accommodating data, right? They're sensible, serious people. Obviously, they wouldn't be doing it if it was too easy. And then the final is using also, again, kind of big open science things, but in a different way. Sort of investigating knowledge transferability across systems of a similar type. So there's some groups who are looking at predictability in coastal ecosystems and using things like systematic review and meta-analysis to figure out where generalizations hold and where they fail, in order to say something about, where we should expect knowledge to transfer across systems and where we should expect it to fail. So these are just three completely different ways in which people are actually tackling the problem, rather than just kind of panicking about the existence of the problem. And I think this is exactly what we want. And I've spoken to two of those three groups, and they are actually I was kind of very pleasantly, I mean, not surprised. Surprise is too harsh, but I was happy to see that they were very welcoming towards a philosopher talking to them. So I had, yeah, good interactions with them too.
Sam, do you want to react on the examples very
No,
quickly?
no, I
No?
think at
Okay.
this point we can just open it up. I mean,
Uh,
we could end up talking for hours, but
I
yeah,
know, but okay, that's perfect. So I
yeah.
think we're perfectly on time, and I think it's going to create many interesting questions and comments by the audience. So please feel free to please raise your hand. Yeah, exactly in this way. Thank you. So, and as always, we're going to try to give a priority to young people. I see that Parvati, you've raised your hand, and I don't know who is going to ask a question because there are several of you on the screen. But anyway, please go. Mauricio, is that you? Okay, please go.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. I was just, this is a question for Alkistis. So some philosophers say that because we have this complex world, scientists assess this complexity by using idealizations. And because you have talked about the relationship between surprise and ecological complexity, my question is, do you feel like this relationship between idealizations and this kind of surprising discoveries that you feel are very important for ecology? And if so, how is that relationship holding in ecology at least?
That's a great question, and I cannot possibly do it justice in anything less than like 3 hours or an entire course. So I'll give you a very short answer. Um, uh, so I agree with those philosophers. Idealization is part of science, and it's an inescapable part of science. If you could have a map that depicted the world exactly, it would be as big as the world and completely not useful. So, like, let's get out of the way. The question is which types of idealizations and what level of idealization and how much idealization and distortion and abstraction, because it's not just idealization, is good for a particular purpose. There is no single answer. It's going to depend. I think that's what ecologists have found. The typical kind of anyway, I don't want to say too much, but you can think of more or less idealization in different ways. You can think that models aim to be general. You can think that models aim to be realistic. You can think that models aim to be precise. That's the Levin's trade-off. And you can have other desiderata for what models are and which will affect how you idealize. And I think we have kind of traditional and historically relevant ideas of how we should have models and what sorts of things they should do, and they don't necessarily always work in ecology in the same way. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Generally, I think that the more complex your system is, well, no, I'm not going to say that because that's not true. If you want, we talk about that with respect to fisheries models in the Oikos paper. So it's a kind of a microcosm of what kind of model is best for this particular purpose. The answer is none, all of them at once.
And just just to amplify that a little bit, the interesting difference between evolution and ecology, that idealizations have never been, well, have been much less of an issue among evolutionary biologists than ecologists. And that's, I think, because there was a poisoning of the well in the early 70s. Bob May, who started as a physicist, he was a great theoretical ecologist, but he recruited a bunch of other physicists who were, for various reasons, thought that they could do ecological modeling without actually talking to biologists and ecologists. And so they published, there's a decade of bad theory modeling that's out there that sort of poisoned the well, so that for literally generations, ecologists didn't want to deal with idealized systems. It always had to be closely linked to uh, empirical systems. Now they've finally gotten over that.
I think overall it's very good if each of you says something on each question. Of course, there will be maybe going more in one direction than the other, but I think overall it's great to have your insights on all questions. Ludo, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Great talk, and I do have a lot of questions, and I'll start, or I'll keep it to this one more general question that is aimed at both of you. Basically, at some point, I think Sam, you suggested that what goes on in science is that many scientists don't have a notion of philosophy of science that goes beyond Popper. Now, I was trained as a molecular biologist and as a philosopher, and I'm now a postdoc in philosophy of biology. And I can tell you that's more or less also true in molecular biology. If they know about any philosophy of science, they'll know about Popper. And that's typically where it ends. And I've often wondered how problematic that is for science in general and for particular disciplines. I'm very sympathetic towards pragmatic use of science. But I am also sensitive, I have to admit, to the idea that perhaps it doesn't matter too much for most scientists most of the time, but they have a very sophisticated philosophy of science backing what they do. I don't have any good reasons for this. This is just a sense that I get, and you would maybe want to try to make some kind of big historical argument, but that's a lot of work and very, very difficult to do. What I suppose I'm asking the both of you is, how much does it matter in ecology that scientists have this rather naive view of philosophy of science, let's say for the progress we're able to make in ecology as a scientific discipline?
Okay, so I'll say where you run into problems is, as you say, that there's this Popperian viewpoint having to do with how theory advances through falsification, and obviously that's only one part of it. And so what I would say is the problem isn't and then there's the disconnect between philosophers and practitioners, that the vast majority of biologists are realists, the vast majority of philosophers are not realists. So there is a disconnect there, not necessarily with a particular philosophy, but just how most philosophers operate. But where I think the problem is, and this has been the project that I've been sort of working on the last 15 years or so, is a misunderstanding of what theory is. So it's not philosophy per se, but it's a misunderstanding of what theory is and how uh, and how under conceptual understanding and conceptual frameworks can improve empirical understanding, mostly by just making things much more explicit, so that people are paying attention to actually what they're doing. It just makes it more efficient. It's really a question of efficiency than anything else.
Yeah. So my personal take on the Popper issue is that it's bad enough when they get it right, and most of the time it's not even right. So a lot of the textbooks, not the ones written by Sam, I have to say, but some of the other textbooks, you get this kind of caricature of Popper, which Popper would be turning in his grave. So it's kind of it's not even right. But kind of philosophy nitpicking aside, I think it hindered actual theoretical progress when people were so obsessed with the fact that you couldn't make predictions because they were just obsessing about not making predictions. And I think one of the good things that has happened recently is that they've stopped talking about Popperian science, and they've actually started looking at how you're going to start being able to make the kinds of predictions that you need to be making. So I think there's been an important shift in attitude in the last 10 years. The other place, though, that I think is a bit, there's a residual difficulty is when you're applying for funding, especially when you're applying for kind of, Europe has them a lot, these kind of big not necessarily interdisciplinary in the wide sense, but kind of within biology groups, or biologists and like one or two philosophers, or biologists and some economists, right? You're applying for these grants, and a lot of people are increasingly relying on grants, and there you have to make grand theoretical claims, which everyone agrees that the research isn't going to support, but you have to make them anyway. So there's kind of this push to make grand claims, even if you don't have that in papers anymore. There's this residual thing in grant applications where you have to make these kind of huge, big, generalizable claims. And I think that's hindering science, because the scientists shouldn't be worried about, how this sounds at this grand level. You don't need the money in order to make the next big theory that will solve everything in ecology at once. That's not why you should be given money, I think. So I think that's the area which is still, these kinds of ideas are sort of lingeringly problematic.
Okay, but just to clarify, you're replying here, Alkistis, to two different aspects. I think one is about Popper and the influence of Popper, and the other is about the influence of trying or not to find a ground theory in ecology, right?
Yes, but I think there's a connection. I think there's a residual kind of a residual thing from the Popperian view of science, which is that you are aiming for not just theory, but bigger and bigger and bigger and more comprehensive theories. And I think that is dangerous, right? Theory is fine, but you don't need to have the one theory that rules them all in order to get money, right? You shouldn't expect your scientists, the postdocs, the PhD students to kind of do that as part of science.
Yeah, after 26 years at NSF, I could talk a lot about grant proposals and the mistakes people make with grant proposals. The biggest being that, yes, they think everything has to be in a Popperian framework, which means what they do is they create straw man hypotheses rather than real hypotheses and actually alternative hypotheses that they're going to test. That's probably the biggest mistake people make. But I would also say that, yes, this notion that you have to have a grand unified theory in biology because that's what physicists do, that's the problem. And you don't do that, that any theory at any of those levels I was talking about, these models, constitutive theories, general theories, all of them, you just define what is the domain. So what's the set of phenomenon that you want that theory to apply to, and then you make sure that your theory then is correct within that domain. And that domain can be narrow, it can be broad, depends on what you want it to do. And they can be overlaying, can be predicted, and that's fine. So that theory pluralism is something which, again, it's this, it goes back to this notion, well, theories are either right or wrong, and you can't have pluralistic, potentially conflicting theories, and that's just not correct.
Thank you. The next question or comment is from Nico, it says Nico.
Yes, thank you. I don't know if that question makes a lot of sense, but it's to both people. How do you guys think about a very reductionist view of science, especially in ecology? And yeah, what are your thoughts on a very reductionist view, and is it harmful?
You want to
Who wants
start?
to start?
Should I?
Short answer, yes, bad. Reductionism, bad. Pluralism, much better. Even if it doesn't solve everything, much better. No. So there's a kind of version of a very, very light reductionism, which is sort of a mechanistic account of explanation in biology, and I'm kind of happy with that. You're only going, I mean, I'm not really happy with that, but I'm not going to die on that hill. That's enough reductionism, though, not more than that. We definitely don't like the layer cake view where you have like ecosystems that are made up of communities, which are made up of populations, which are made up of organisms, and all of these things might nicely fit into each other, all the way down to molecules and atoms. That doesn't work. It doesn't work in terms of explanations, it doesn't work in terms of predictions, so no.
Yeah, so I mean the problem with reductionism is it fails to recognize the importance of emergent properties. I mean which is a hallmark of complex systems, which is true for all of biology, right? At any level, right? An enzyme works through an emergent property that's more than just the properties of the individual atoms in that molecule. And so, on the other hand, that's not to say that you can't have uh, explanation and prediction and understanding at just a molecular level. It's just you can't, you don't want to say, well, if we only need to understand things at the molecular level, and then everything else above it will automatically get understood. I mean, this is to take somebody who was just in the news, Watson, who just died, right? He tried to, push that in terms of genetics, right? All we have to know is the sequence of DNA, and then we'll understand all of how organisms work. And there's still a lot of that. And that's that sort of simplistic reductionism is bad, and especially when it comes to things like how science gets funded and how science gets organized. And yeah, at least in the U.S., I don't know what biology academia in Europe is like, but in the U.S., you have biology departments that say, oh, we only want to hire molecular biologists because, one, that's where all the money is, and that's where all the understanding is going to come from.
At the same time, I don't think these sort of super large scale levels of doing science are in principle more privileged either. It's going to be a case by case basis. Sometimes you need to look at the ecosystem level in biology. Sometimes you need to look at the molecular level. Sometimes you need to look at multiple levels at once. And
Yes.
figuring out the right way to carve up the phenomenon that you're interested in studying is half of the work. So I think it's part of science to be able to figure out the appropriate way of carving up the world in order to make the best sense of it. Very good question.
Nico, do you want to follow up? It seems that you raise your hand again, so maybe it's better to continue it.
No, it would be a second different question that had nothing to do with the first one. But if someone else raised their hand,
thank you.
yes.
Thank you. So then, Marie, you're next.
Thank you. My question is actually very related to the last one. So I think a lot of people working in ecology are looking for the laws of ecology or even the laws of nature. And for this, they are trying to make big generalizations about the system that they are working with. But at the same time, you have all these studies that are showing how much a factor X or Y could totally change the outcome of an interaction, like the example of the predator-prey reversal. So my question is, how can we reconcile these two? Should we even try? Does it even make sense? Or it's just like we are trying to look at different scales in which context dependency should matter more or less depending on what we want to do with the science we are making?
Shall I go first, or do you want to go first?
You go first, and I've got an
So
interesting
I have
point.
a lot to say about laws in biology, ecology especially. So just kind of a bit of background. The philosophers of biology, not ecology, but biology more generally, were the first to look at the problem of laws in biology, and they kind of, people like Sandy Mitchell, and others argued that the fact that biology doesn't fit laws of nature in the way that we learned from physics and chemistry means that we should change our view of laws rather than rather than say that biology is a science that doesn't have laws. So there's these two kind of opposing views. Now in ecology, things got kind of even kind of more animated in terms of laws, because even the kinds of generalizations that people like Sandy Mitchell and Jim Woodward say that exist in biology because they are stable or invariant across certain contexts, ecology has many cases where you don't even have that. So I have my view on this is that, yeah, you can try and look for laws in ecology. Good luck. I think it's a wasted it's a wasted endeavor. So that's laws. And then the question is, what you should be looking for instead is the scope of generalizations that are going to be appropriate for the kind of thing that you need to do. And my claim is that it's often much, the extent of the generalization that you actually need is much less than you might expect. So that's my take on it, and that's kind of outlined in the book. Not outlined. I harp on about it quite a bit.
So yeah, I'm not disagreeing, but so what I've said is a law is simply a model with 5 or fewer parameters, right? And e ecology and biology have are just as law-like as physics, right? So Newton's law. Remember, they start by saying, assume a frictionless plane, right? So physics is, if you try to take physics laws and apply them in the real world, those models immediately start to get complicated, just the way they do in biology. It's just the physicists just sort of sweep all that under the rug and say, "Oh, but we have this real simple equation." Well, we do in biology, right? The law of population growth is a law, and then when you want to apply it, then you have to add the additional parameters to account for the particular situation. Uh, so. Uh, so yes, we those laws are useful, right? Those laws, if you want to call them that, right? So the Lotka-Volterra equations that Alkistis put up, you could think of that as a law, and that's great because that is a starting point model that you can then apply to a specific situation, either by adding parameters or calculating particular parameter values and so forth.
I just want to add very quickly that these are the main two views currently in philosophy of science too. So either you think that the idea of laws of nature is too strict and not even physics has them. So Nancy Cartwright famously wrote How the Laws of Physics Lie, precisely because the ceteris paribus clauses that you have to add to make the laws actually work mean that they're not universal and exceptionless in the way that we used to think. Now, some people say, well, okay, so you have this diminished view of laws and then lots of generalizations in biology fit them. And then the question is whether that's the case in ecology. Some people think yes, some people think no. And then there's the other view, which is no, like it's given that there's so many exceptions to laws, it's pointless to talk about them. Just talk about generalizations and take it from there. And both are, I think, kind of, it's one of those cases where no side has actually won. I think these views are strong in philosophy of science still.
Okay, thanks. That's very useful. Nico, again.
Yes, thank you. At some point, there was talk about probability distributions and I just had questions. Can we always use probability distributions as probabilities? And what do we do when we can't do that? AKA, what do we do when there's like deep uncertainty?
Well, deep uncertainty is still a probability distribution. It's just your probability distribution is flat. Um, so there's and because there's various types of uncertainty, right? There's uncertainty in the information that's coming in, right? Alkistis is talking about this, the data problem. And then there's the stochasticity of the system itself. And even if well, even if something is perfectly deterministic, then it could also be chaotic, which is predictable, but again, then you've got it's the data problem of where are you on that chaotic system based on the data that you have on hand, trying to be predictive. It depends on, what your time frame is and what matters. So, Alkistis?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Just that I think, as with all complex systems and predictions, there are various ways to parse probability and various ways of kind of presenting the uncertainty in the system. And yes, ecologists are increasingly using more of them, and I think they should do more of that. So one kind of hitherto undervalued way of presenting uncertainty is to kind of reduce the precision of predictions, rather than have precise predictions with sort of lower confidence values, actually reduce the precision of the model output itself, or don't try and correct for an imprecise model output. And I think that kind of captures some of the data uncertainty in some cases, for example. So I think there's lots of stuff that is being done and could be done within ecology on probabilities.
All right, we have a question that comes from PhilInBioMed.
Yes, hello, and thanks to both contributions. I have a question for Alkistis regarding the concept of surprises. So you gave us the example of the whelks and the lobsters, but there couldn't one say it's not really a failure of the model, but rather of a background assumption, which is that the predator stays the predator across these different contexts. So yeah, to what extent are these surprises maybe not due to wrong or not generalizable models, but rather to background assumptions?
Well, you put your finger on it, right? What happens when a prediction, I mean, this is the Duhem-Quine problem, right? What happens when our prediction fails? This is one of the last nails in the coffin for Popper, right? What happens when our prediction fails? You don't actually succeed in theory advancement because you don't really know why it failed. You need to at least do more kind of science to figure out why the thing failed. So, it could be that this assumption that predators are always predators is just false. Now we know that. But still, the interesting thing is that cases of predator-prey reversal are very, very rare. So what do you do with this additional information? Do you say, well, let's throw the Lotka-Volterra set of models completely out the window? Well, it works for many cases. It doesn't work for some, but it still works for many, many cases. So it's kind of, I think what it shows you is that you should have a different attitude towards, you shouldn't be surprised by surprises. Right? These surprises are going to happen in ecology. They're going to happen everywhere in all of science, but in system, in complex heterogeneous systems, they're going to be happening with a much higher frequency. So you should expect to be surprised in many, many ways. Sometimes it's going to be background assumptions. Sometimes it's going to be kind of the inner workings of the model theory in this case. And sometimes it's going to be something completely different. Like, for example, in the case of plant soil feedback, you have a negative relationship between the plant growth and the soil properties. And then 1 year, this changes, and an invasion happens because the plants that were there were hindered by the soil properties, and then the soil properties changed. Right? That's a surprising result, and you can still explain it. You know why it happened, but that doesn't mean that you could have anticipated that it happened. But once it does happen, then you should be anticipating the possibility that something like that might happen again. So it's a very long answer to the question, but I can't find a simpler way of saying it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add. Yes, biologists, not only should you not be surprised by surprise, but I would say most practitioners like surprises because that's the fun new stuff. Oh boy, we never thought that this would happen, or here's some cool new organism. And a lot of it is just, despite hundreds of years of natural history, there's still a whole lot of natural history we just don't know.
Except, and this comes out a bit in the meta-research literature, that there is a publication bias towards positive results. So it's actually harder to publish neutral or negative results. And a lot of these surprises would fall into that category. So I think kind of part of being, not being surprised by being surprised needs a kind of shift in attitude towards what should get published and what shouldn't.
Yeah, and that's also been changing.
Yes, it is.
I really want to encourage people in the audience to ask their questions. We have two wonderful speakers. They agreed to stay a little bit more, so we still have about 5 minutes. So Jerry, you're next. Thank you.
Thank you. So a wonderful discussion. Appreciate it from the philosophy of science perspective, as well as from the mathematical, pragmatic applications to biology, and particularly in my case to human health and the origins of health and disease, which are ecologically and evolutionarily related concepts. So from that perspective, I really wonder how either of you or both of you feel about the origins of the creativity of natural systems, such that all of these quote unquote surprises can emerge. Is there any origin to natural creativity? And if so, what is it?
You're talking about creativity of natural systems, right? Where does that come from? Mutation. I mean, in the broad sense, right? So, I mean, this is what, natural selection, and other phenotypic changes, phenotypic plasticity and so forth, create changes. And if they can be successful, then, it doesn't take much for selection to operate and create new diversity.
Yeah, I agree. And I will quickly add that there's a very interesting literature in philosophy of biology on the evolution of evolvability itself, which I think I have not written anything about it, but good people have.
Well,
yeah, basically, in order for life to have survived for, billions of years, it has to, evolvability has to be built into the system. Otherwise, it will have gone extinct.
Well, it so happens I did my PhD thesis many years ago on the notion of mutation, and I had the most obnoxious mutations you could imagine in even the simple bacterium E. coli. And from that context, I learned that the word mutation simply means the word change. And so it's really just a cyclic argument that you're responding to my question with. And that's not a criticism. I understand why you want to respond that way, but I was looking for something deeper from a philosophical perspective.
Maybe that's a great topic for the next debate.
Yes.
I think with 3 minutes left, we can't possibly do it justice.
Yeah, it seems to be a big question anyway, so maybe something indeed to address in the future. And anyway, I promised our speakers to release them not too late. So really, I want to thank you, Alkistis and Sam. Let me clap again virtually. It was great and really a promising, I think, format for this seminar. So thank you very much. Thank you to all who asked questions. And as you know, this will be recorded. And this has been recorded, sorry, and do not hesitate to share this with other people. I know that some people wanted to attend and could not. So again, I want to thank you, Sam and Alkistis, for a great, great discussion. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation. This has been
Yeah,
great fun.
likewise, I enjoyed it a lot.
Thanks a lot. See you soon. Bye-bye.